great delight finally to be connected with the Multicultural Center, and we can't thank you enough for all that you give to our community and our students. And I'm guessing that there are some people here who may not yet have read The House of Six Doors, in which case I'd say you're in for a real treat, but beware. This book arrived in my house, an advance copy at, I think, the end of last year, and I came back to visit my mother for Christmas holidays, just for 10 days. And because it was Christmas, I had to get my Christmas cards ready and Christmas presents, and I was going to Jerusalem 2 days after Christmas, so I had to prepare for that trip. And I actually had a book of my own I had to proofread and print out and deliver to the publishers back east. So I really had my plate full. And then I made a fatal mistake, absolutely fatal. Sounds like you can guess what it is. There went my morning, there went my afternoon, there went the next morning, there went most of the next afternoon. When I started reading Patricia's book, I just couldn't stop. It enveloped me. I just wanted to keep reading, and I did, and I threw everything aside. And I think part of it is, as some of you may know if you have read it, that it's this wonderfully vivid and detailed evocation of California in the 1970s as seen through the eyes of a 13-year-old girl, Serena, who comes from very far away, in which people are listening to Carly Simon's Anticipation or A Horse with No Name. Dirty Harry is playing at the local cinema. And I was a little boy myself in California there, and it was like a time capsule. I was transported so immediately that it was like walking through those times again. But as you probably also know, it's this spellbinding story of a mother with two teenage daughters who goes to Hollywood in search of the American dreams that she's nurtured from afar. So it's a coming-of-age story involving those daughters. And it's also, and this is why it's perfect that we're in the Multicultural Center, a story of immigration. And some of you probably know that, I'd say, and especially in the last 20 years, American literature has been made and remade by newcomers from Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, from India, from Vietnam, from Korea. And The House of Six Doors fits just perfectly into that tradition. And in fact, without making a fuss about it, it's almost unobtrusive. But as you continue reading, you notice that Patricia has given us a California that's made up almost entirely of immigrants, looking out for one another, helping each other to navigate the new system, really creating a new America in our midst. And my mother, who of course is a very seasoned reader, more than I am, was saying to me not so long ago that as a tale of immigration, she thought it was far better than Jhumpa Lahiri. Jhumpa Lahiri, who's won the Pulitzer Prize and been #1 on the Times bestseller list. And in my mother's very discerning opinion, this book actually trumps it. And it would be hard to find someone to challenge that opinion, I'd say. Maybe not impossible, but hard. And the only other thing I'll say is, just as Zavini said in her introduction, I think any of you who's ever thought about belonging and assimilation and the split between generations, especially among people who come here carrying old cultures, will instantly relate to it. At the same time as you're transported to these two magical places, one California in the 70s, a bit less magical, but even more magical, the island that suffuses and haunts every sentence of this book, Curacao, which I have never encountered in the pages of English literature before. Its fragrances, its tropical breezes, the sound of the sea, and even more deeply, I think, its traditional wisdom, which is associated for the two girls with the grandmother who still lives there, is almost the anchor for them as they navigate the stormy waters of their new home. So it's perfect. Some of you may know that this is the first book in human history that comes with something called Click-to-See, which is a new technology that brings to your smartphone multimedia things to complement the text. And it's perfect for a book that's so sensual and so aromatic with the spices of both Hollywood Boulevard and Curacao. And I'll just... and I'll just end by saying that I don't know Patricia and Jim and their sons very well, but the way I've got to know them is that it seems every time there's some giant of literature visiting UCSB Arts and Lectures, whether it's Orhan Pamuk, winner of the Nobel Prize, or Amy Tan, or many others, Jim and Patricia very graciously host a reception for them. And so I've met them in the context of literature, and it's so wonderful that now you have made your own significant contribution to this same literature. The one thing I can never forgive her is that, as I understand it, English is Patricia's third or maybe fourth language, and she writes it more beautifully than those of us for whom it's our only language. So I've been waiting for months to ask her all kinds of questions. But please join me in welcoming Patricia Selbert.
Thank you. Thank you. Smile.
It's very heartfelt.
Thank you so much for that fabulous, fabulous introduction. That's really touching. I have to tell you that when I first received your email, with that beautifully composed email, letting me know that you read my book and that you loved my book, I jumped out of my chair, ran around my office 3 times, screaming. I was so excited.
Thank you.
It means the world to me to have an author like you who's so prolific, so eloquent, and so inspiring. Praise my work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
well,
you.
now we're both happy. We can finish the evening and go home. But, no, thank you so much. And that was only the first time I read it. I read it at least once since then. So, and I think I'm keen to ask about the book, but I think maybe the natural way to begin is to ask you a little bit about your background. Now, you were born, as I gather, in Venezuela, is that right?
Yes, my parents are Dutch. Well, my mother's from Curacao, my father's from Amsterdam, but they were in Venezuela, in Puerto Ordaz, which used to be the jungle and a small little town where they just found oil. And my parents were selling ball bearings there in the middle of huts to the oil company, the oil encampments that were looking for oil, the oil companies.
So Spanish was your first language?
Spanish was my first language.
And then you moved to Curacao?
And then my parents went back to Curacao, and Dutch was always our language at home. My mother was very intent that we were Dutch. We were from Curacao, but we were Dutch. Yes. That was the most important thing.
And probably a lot of people there like to attach themselves to the Netherlands.
Yes, yes. The Netherlands was the mother country, and therefore it was the country that, had more status.
And then there's a native language, is it Paramantú?
Papiamentu.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yes.
Which is an indigenous language.
It's an indigenous language. It is a language made up of 7 different primary languages. One is West African, and it came about during the early 1600s as a slave language and communicating, because Curacao used to be a port, a hub for slavery. The ships would stop there and then would change cargo and move to the US or Brazil or all those places. So there were people from every country of Europe and Africa and South America, and so the language rose from that.
And it's a place of immigrants too, therefore, and it's
very
a melting
much
pot
so.
Also, but of a very different kind from this one.
Yes, very much
more harmoniously integrated, would you say? Or?
More harmoniously, yes. It's a longer history, so yes, it's they found a way to make it harmonious. It's a small island, so you have to get along.
How many people are there?
About 150,000 at any
small.
time.
So size of Santa Barbara, almost.
Yes,
it's
small
probably
island.
Sometimes too small a world.
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
And how old were you when you came to this country?
I was 13,
I
the
see.
same age as Serena.
And did you come to Florida and then go to...
Actually, I did that part of it, yeah.
Yes.
But that was inspired by my own experience.
And I'm guessing that when you were either in Florida or California, nobody had heard of Curacao or knew how to place you.
No, nobody had heard of Curacao. And also, so I would say we're Dutch, we're from Curacao, and everybody would say, well, where's that?
Yeah.
And I'd have to explain it's 40 miles north of Venezuela. And then they'd say, well, is it Spanish? And no, it's Dutch. And it was always very confusing.
They'd get even more confused the more you explained, probably.
Yes.
So. And I mean, I think one of the other things that must have been an unusual factor is that if a Guatemalan or an Indian or Vietnamese comes to California, especially now, there's a huge community waiting for them. Whereas there couldn't have been any people from Curacao.
No, there weren't any people. Well, there were no people from Curacao. There were some people from Suriname that we had met. But what happened was, because we were Dutch and because we spoke Dutch and we spoke Spanish and we spoke Papiamento, and we were used to dealing with many different cultures. We sort of, tried to fit in. And Spanish-speaking people was the connection. So we would have a Spanish-speaking community. That would be our connection point.
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely in the book that everywhere they turn, there's someone from Peru, or they go to the Cuban market, or someone from Suriname, and they enter this whole web of, and there's a real solidarity, it seems, because all the immigrants are having to face the same issues and helping each other through. And that was your experience when you came here.
Right.
However did you manage to evoke California in 1972 so precisely? Did you keep a diary at the time? Or?
No, I'm dyslexic, and I remember things in pictures. So I have vivid pictures in my head, but I have difficulty, more difficulty with words, remembering words. So, I'd remember things in pictures, and then I would do research on it on the internet and try and find and see, how it all fit together. And I'd speak to people that, said, "Oh, I lived in Hollywood," and that, "Really? What did you remember?" And so on, and things that I remembered, I would go back and do research on.
And a good memory for sounds too, I think. For songs, for TV
for
programs.
Songs, yes, because songs are different. When it's to music, it's a very different media. It transports the barrier of the short-term memory, dyslexia, the wording. Yes. And it's not so much long-term memory, it's short-term memory dyslexia, where you hear something, you have to write it down or repeat it immediately. That is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's something so poignant here that when the girls arrive in Los Angeles, they know it from the Andy Griffith Show and from Bonanza and all these things, but of course reality is so different. They think they know it, and yet it's nothing like the place they imagined. That's how it was for you, probably, was it?
It was how it was for me. The hardest aspect of immigrating to a new country, I found, was connecting, finding a place to feel connected to other people, where you really had that comfortable place where you walked into each other's house or sat with each other and could really open up, and when you were sad or when you were happy, just sharing. And that happens much later on when you first immigrate. There are lots of barriers. It's difficult to connect in a deeper level.
Everything's getting lost in translation at some level.
That too.
And people didn't know what to make of you, I would think.
Right. So yes, I was very different and didn't quite fit in. And so there were a lot of feelings that were not expressed and that were not seen. So you become sort of invisible.
Also, I won't say introspective, but you probably become observant, because that makes for a kind of inwardness. That because you weren't expressing your feelings and because everything was new to you, I think you were taking in much more as you walked down those streets than others would be.